The neighborhood was quiet that Saturday afternoon, the kind of stillness only suburban cul-de-sacs could conjure. Lawns glistened under the early fall sun, trimmed and combed into submission. American flags swayed lazily from porches, and kids' bicycles leaned against driveways. It was the sort of place that promised safety, stability, and predictability. But beneath the manicured hedges and HOA newsletters, resentment brewed like storm clouds. Mark Donovan knew it well. He had lived on Willow Creek Lane for just 3 months, having bought the modest 2-story house at the edge of the cul-de-sac. To his neighbors, he was the quiet man with steel-gray eyes who kept to himself. He didn't show up at barbecues, never joined the HOA meetings, and declined every welcome to the neighborhood dinner invitation. That was enough for suspicion to grow in a place where sameness was considered safety. At 42, Mark had seen the worst of humanity. He had chased cartels through the deserts of Texas, broken up sleeper cells in New Jersey, and sat across interrogation tables from men who admitted to atrocities without blinking. He carried those ghosts silently, locking them away behind the stoic mask he wore like armor. No one here knew that. To the people of Willow Creek, he was just that guy with the Jeep and the attitude problem. Mark sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching a golden retriever trot across a lawn that wasn't its own. He smirked faintly at the thought of the HOA president, Marjorie Klein, fuming about pet boundaries in her next newsletter. Marjorie was the self-anointed queen of Willow Creek. Early 60s, stiff blonde curls lacquered into place, voice sharp enough to cut glass. She had made it her mission to maintain standards, and Mark's indifference to those standards put him at the top of her unspoken enemies list. Inside the house, Mark's phone buzzed. He ignored it. The world he had walked away from, the bureau, the endless flights, the whispered threats in foreign tongues, was still trying to pull him back. But he had retired early, burned out, scarred in ways even he didn't fully admit. This house, this street, this ordinary life. He wanted to believe it could be his refuge. But peace is a fragile thing. At exactly 3:17 p.m., a pair of black SUVs rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac. They weren't government issue. They weren't even tinted properly. The windows rattled faintly with cheap aftermarket mods, and their glossy paint jobs screamed intimidation more than authority. Neighbors peeked through curtains, curious. The SUVs stopped in front of Mark's driveway. 4 men stepped out. They wore dark tactical vests with the letters HPD crudely stenciled across the front in peeling white paint. Their belts sagged with handcuffs and flashlights, but the holsters were empty. No firearms, just props. Their boots were new, barely scuffed, as if they had been ordered online last week. Fake cops, Mark muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. He could spot counterfeit authority the way a wolf could smell blood. The tallest of the men, a broad-shouldered guy with a buzz cut and an air of misplaced confidence, shouted across the lawn. "Mark Donovan, step down from the porch. You're in violation of community code, and we're here to place you under arrest." The words hit the cul-de-sac like a grenade. Curtains fluttered wider. Cell phones appeared in trembling hands. Marjorie Klein herself emerged from her porch across the street, her robe flapping, her expression gleeful beneath a mask of faux concern. Mark didn't move. He simply took another sip of his coffee. "Community code?" He called back, his voice calm, level, the kind of tone that didn't invite negotiation. "Since when does a homeowners association have an armed police force?" Buzzcut smirked. "Since you refused to comply with repeated notices. You're harboring unauthorized equipment on your property." Section 12, Article 9. Mark glanced at his driveway. His Jeep Wrangler sat there, mud-splattered from his last trip into the woods. On the rear bumper, a small, hardened case was bolted, military-grade, weatherproof, a gift from a colleague long ago. To the untrained eye, it looked like something suspicious. To Marjorie, it was probably a violation waiting to be weaponized. "You boys don't want to do this," Mark said evenly, setting his mug down on the railing. One of the men, shorter, jittery, sweat beading at his temple, lifted a pair of handcuffs as if to prove their resolve. "Come quietly, and it'll go easy." Mark's jaw flexed. Memories stirred, unwanted. Back rooms lit with bare bulbs. Men trying to break him with words, threats, force. He had endured worse than this little theater act. And he wasn't about to let these imposters drag him off his own porch in front of gaping neighbors. He stood slowly, his full 6'1" frame casting a shadow across the men. His eyes locked on Buzz Cut's, unflinching. The kind of look that made hardened criminals squirm. "You've got about 5 seconds to turn around and leave," Mark said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of command, the echo of years spent giving orders that meant life or death. Buzz Cut hesitated. He hadn't expected defiance. He'd expected fear, or maybe pleading. But there was something in Mark's eyes, a coldness, a history, that made his bravado falter. From across the street, Marjorie shouted, "Don't you dare back down. He's a danger to this neighborhood. He threatened me last week when I told him to trim his hedges." Mark let out a sharp breath through his nose. "Lady," he said without looking at her, "if words about hedges count as threats, you've lived a charmed life." The men shifted uncomfortably. Jittery fidgeted with the cuffs. Another glanced at the SUV as if calculating retreat. But Buzz Cut doubled down, taking a step forward. "This is your last warning. We're authorized to use force." Mark's lips curled into the faintest, most dangerous smile. "You have no idea who you're talking to." The air grew taut, heavy. The kind of silence before something breaks. Neighbors held their breath. Even Marjorie, for all her bluster, leaned back slightly as though sensing she had unleashed something she couldn't control. Mark moved then, not fast, not reckless, but precise. He stepped off the porch with the controlled grace of a predator. His hand shot forward, grabbing Buzz Cut's vest, yanking him off balance. In one fluid motion, Mark twisted, slammed the man against the SUV, and pinned him with an armbar that made Buzz Cut cry out. The other three froze, shock plastered across their faces. "Listen carefully," Mark hissed, his mouth close to the man's ear, his tone low enough for only him to hear. "If you ever set foot on my property again, if you ever pretend to wear authority you haven't earned, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life wishing you hadn't crossed me." "Understood," Buzz Cut whimpered, nodding furiously. Mark released him, stepping back. The man stumbled, clutching his arm. For a beat, no one moved. Then, as if on cue, the four piled into the SUVs and sped away, tires squealing, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and a street full of stunned silence. Mark stood in the driveway, chest heaving once, then steadying. His neighbors stared openly now, whispering into phones, no doubt spreading the story faster than wildfire. Marjorie's face had gone pale beneath her makeup. She retreated inside, slamming her door. Mark picked up his coffee, took a long drink, and muttered to himself, "Welcome to Willow Creek." But deep inside, he knew this wasn't over. Whoever had sent those men hadn't just wanted to scare him. They wanted something else. Something connected to the life he thought he'd left behind. And that meant trouble was only beginning. That night, Willow Creek felt different. The streetlights hummed faintly, the crickets seemed quieter, and Mark noticed shadows lingering at the edges of driveways as neighbors whispered about him. He knew the type of gossip spreading, dangerous, paranoid speculation. Inside his house, the silence pressed on him. He sat at the kitchen table, cleaning the knife he had used to cut steak earlier, his mind replaying the confrontation. Fake HOA police, a stunt both absurd and dangerous. But behind the cheap costumes and shaky authority, there had been intent. Those men weren't random thrill seekers. Someone had organized them. His phone buzzed again. This time, he answered. "Donovan." A woman's voice, sharp, professional. "You've been busy." Mark's jaw tightened. "Hello, Director." FBI Director Ellen Graves didn't waste time. "We've had eyes on you since you left the bureau. My office got wind of an incident this afternoon in your cul-de-sac. Care to explain why 4 imposters in tactical vests tried to take you in broad daylight?" Mark leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Looks like some HOA fantasy gone too far. Probably that woman across the street. She's been itching to make me her personal crusade." Ellen's voice dropped lower. "Don't play coy. Those men are connected to something bigger. We've been tracking a domestic extremist group calling themselves the Foundation. Ex-military washouts, wannabe enforcers, angry men looking to reclaim order. Guess where they've been recruiting? Mark's chest went still. Don't tell me. Neighborhood associations, Ellen confirmed. Middle America is fertile ground. They hide behind rules and codes until they feel strong enough to flex muscle. Today wasn't random. They came for you, Mark. Which means they know who you are. He clenched his jaw. Retirement had been his line in the sand. No more missions, no more blood. But if his past had already bled into Willow Creek, then the illusion of peace was shattered. Do I need to come back in? He asked, the old reflex pulling at him. Ellen hesitated. Not yet, but stay alert. If they try again, I want them alive. We need intel. The line went dead. Mark sat there, the weight of inevitability pressing against him. He hadn't been out of the game long enough for the game to forget him. The next morning, the knock came at dawn. Hard, insistent. Mark opened the door to find Marjorie Klein standing there, flanked by two neighbors, Harold, the retired dentist, and Jenny, the PTA mom who always carried a binder of notes. Marjorie's eyes gleamed with manufactured righteousness. Mr. Donovan, she began, we can't have violent episodes like yesterday's in Willow Creek. Several families have expressed concern. We've convened an emergency HOA session tonight. Attendance is mandatory. Mark stared at her, his coffee steaming in one hand. Mandatory. Jenny jumped in quickly. It's for everyone's safety. We want to make sure our community is stable. Harold just shifted uncomfortably, muttering, yeah, stable. Mark's instincts screamed. This wasn't about hedges or noise ordinances. This was a summons. The foundation was already embedding itself into his neighborhood, testing who would bend and who would break. He gave Marjorie a flat smile. I'll be there. That evening, the community center at the edge of Willow Creek buzzed with forced cheer. A pot of coffee sat on a folding table, styrofoam cups stacked high. But the mood was anything but friendly. The residents sat in a semicircle of metal chairs, eyes flicking toward Mark as he entered. Marjorie stood at the front, gavel in hand, though there was no reason to have one. She tapped it against the table anyway. Order, please. Beside her sat three men Mark hadn't seen before. They weren't residents. Their tactical jackets, buzz cuts, and deliberate posture gave them away immediately. Foundation recruiters. Marjorie cleared her throat. We're here to address the incident of violence yesterday, in which Mr. Donovan assaulted individuals tasked with enforcing community rules. That's not what happened, Mark said evenly, his voice cutting through the room. They impersonated police and trespassed on my property. That's a felony. One of the foundation men smirked. Only if you believe the state still has authority. We're building something better here. A murmur rippled through the residents. Some nodded nervously, as if afraid to disagree. Others looked confused. Marjorie raised her chin. Mr. Donovan, you have consistently refused to comply with neighborhood expectations. You represent a threat to unity. Mark stepped forward, eyes locked on the men beside her. You're being used, he told the neighbors. These guys don't care about your lawns or your fences. They want control. And if you hand it over, you'll never get it back. The smirking man leaned back, his voice oily. Funny talk from a man who spent 20 years enforcing the government's control. Tell them who you really are, Donovan. Tell them what you've done. Gasps circled the room. Marjorie's eyes sparkled with vindication. Yes. Why don't you tell us? Mark's blood ran cold. They knew. They had dug deep enough to find his file. He took a breath, steadying himself. I was FBI. Counterterrorism. I've seen what happens when small groups of fanatics convince ordinary people to hand over their freedom piece by piece. It never ends well. If you think these men care about your kids riding bikes safely down Willow Creek, you're already lost. The room erupted, some shouting in defense of Mark, others echoing Marjorie's outrage. The three foundation men stood, their presence filling the space like a threat. The smirker leaned close to Mark, voice low enough for only him to hear. You're not scaring us, Agent. You're next on the list. Sleep light. Mark met his gaze without flinching. You made one mistake already. You came to my house. The meeting dissolved in chaos. Neighbors hurried out, whispers swirling. Marjorie stormed away, furious. And Mark walked into the night, every nerve alive. The foundation wasn't just circling. They had moved in. At home, he checked his Jeep. The military case on the bumper had been tampered with, the bolts loosened. Inside was nothing explosive, just old field gear. But the message was clear: we can reach you anywhere. He sat on the porch, a pistol now resting on the table beside him. The weight familiar, unwelcome, but necessary. For the first time since leaving the bureau, Mark felt the old fire stirring. The hunter inside him, the man he had buried under suburbia, was awake again. And this time, the battlefield was his own front yard. The quiet of Willow Creek was about to shatter. The attack came 3 nights later. It was 2:43 a.m. when the motion sensor lights in Mark's backyard flared to life, cutting through the darkness with a white-hot beam. He was already awake, his instincts pulling him from sleep long before the bulbs lit up. Years of training did that. His body recognized danger before his mind fully caught up. He rolled out of bed silently, barefoot, his Glock already in his hand. From the upstairs window, he scanned the yard. Nothing moved. The trees swayed gently. The shed sat still. The Jeep glinted faintly under moonlight. Then he saw it, the faint red glow of a laser dot skimming across the back fence. Mark's heart rate didn't spike. He breathed slow, steady, forcing calm into his body. He moved to the hallway, checked the stairwell. The creak of a floorboard downstairs told him what he needed to know. They were already inside. The front door had been jimmied, the lock pried open with crude efficiency. 3 men, all in the same half-baked HBD vests, crept through the living room with flashlights taped to shotguns. Their movements were sloppy but dangerous, amateurs with deadly toys. From the top of the stairs, Mark watched them fan out. One headed toward the kitchen, another toward the hallway closet, the third creeping closer to the staircase itself. Mark didn't hesitate. He descended fast and silent, years of muscle memory guiding his steps. He reached the last stair just as the nearest intruder swung his flashlight beam across the wall. Mark grabbed the barrel of the shotgun, twisted hard, and drove his elbow into the man's face. Bone cracked, the intruder crumpled, and Mark yanked the weapon free. The crash alerted the others. "He's here," one shouted. Shotgun blasts roared, shredding drywall, filling the air with dust and splinters. Mark rolled behind the sofa, returning fire with precise, controlled shots. The man in the kitchen went down, clutching his shoulder, screaming. The third dove for cover near the hallway, firing blindly. Mark moved like a shadow, circling, closing the distance. He wasn't fighting like a neighbor defending his home. He was fighting like the most feared FBI agent the Bureau had ever fielded. Every step calculated, every strike lethal. The last intruder bolted for the door. Mark was faster. He tackled him into the wall, driving his forearm into the man's throat. "Who sent you?" Mark demanded, voice low, dangerous. The man choked, spit blood, tried to snarl. "The Foundation, we run this street now. You're dead already." Mark slammed him harder. "Names? I don't know them. Orders came from up top. They want the case on your Jeep." "What's in it?" Mark's eyes narrowed. That case was nothing more than field gear and a few encrypted drives from his final operation. Drives that, in the wrong hands, could expose everything. Witness lists, undercover contacts, even safe houses. The Foundation didn't just want power, they wanted intelligence. He pressed harder. "Where's your leader?" The man's lips curled into a bloodied smile. "Closer than you think." Suddenly, headlights blazed through the front window. SUVs roared up, doors slamming open. More men spilled out. 10, maybe 12. This wasn't a break-in. This was a full-scale assault. Mark cursed under his breath. He had minutes, maybe less, before his home became a war zone. He grabbed the intruder by the vest and dragged him to the living room, shoving him against the window as a human shield. From outside, a voice boomed through a bullhorn. "Mark Donovan, step out now, hands on your head. You're surrounded. You don't belong here." Mark recognized the voice instantly. The smirker from the HOA meeting. The Foundation's recruiter. "You picked the wrong house," Mark muttered, then shoved the intruder aside and dove into action. The firefight erupted like thunder. Gunfire shattered windows, splinters and glass spraying across the living room. Mark fired back, precise and unrelenting, dropping 2 men before they even crossed the yard. He moved from cover to cover, his mind a chessboard of angles and timing. But they kept coming. More boots pounding pavement, more shouts. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. They wanted him gone. Mark ducked into the kitchen, grabbed a smoke grenade from the military case he had dragged inside earlier, yanked the pin, and tossed it through the broken window. The yard filled with thick, gray haze. Shouts turned to coughing, confusion. He slipped out the back door, circling wide. In the chaos, he caught sight of Marjorie Klein standing on her porch in a bathrobe, clapping her hands like some deranged queen approving of the spectacle. His rage simmered, but he stayed focused. She was part of this, but the real target was the foundation. Through the smoke, he stalked them one by one. A strike to the throat here, a gun wrenched from a hand there. Bodies hit the ground with sickening thuds. Fear began to ripple through the mob. Finally, the recruiter himself appeared, bullhorn discarded, rifle in hand. "Donovan," he shouted into the chaos. "You think you scare us? You're just a washed-up Fed living on borrowed time." Mark stepped out of the smoke, calm, steady, eyes locked. Borrowed time's all I ever needed. The 2 men squared off, rifles raised. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to just them, predator against predator. The recruiter fired first. Mark rolled, the bullet grazing his shoulder. Pain flared hot, but he didn't falter. He returned fire, a single precise shot that sent the recruiter sprawling to the pavement, weapon clattering away. Silence fell. The smoke thinned. Survivors scrambled, dragging their wounded, retreating into SUVs. Tires screeched, engines roared, and within minutes the cul-de-sac was empty again, save for shattered glass and shell casings glinting in the moonlight. Mark stood there, bleeding, chest heaving, watching them flee. Neighbors peeked from windows, pale faces pressed against glass. Willow Creek would never see him the same way again. But Mark didn't care. He knew this wasn't victory. It was only a warning shot in a war that had just begun. As dawn crept over the horizon, Mark bandaged his shoulder and sat on the porch, rifle resting across his knees. The golden retriever from earlier wandered up and sat at his feet, as if sensing the shift in the air. The quiet suburban dream was dead. Willow Creek had become a battlefield, and Mark Donovan was done hiding. The aftermath of the firefight left Willow Creek shaken to its core. By sunrise, the cul-de-sac was littered with shattered glass, bullet holes punched through white siding, and scorch marks from smoke grenades. The neighborhood looked less like a suburban dream and more like a war zone. Police cruisers finally showed up at 6 a.m., lights flashing, but their arrival felt almost theatrical. They asked a few questions, took a few statements, and when they learned the name Mark Donovan, their tone shifted. Some of the officers looked at him with respect, others with fear. They knew who he was, or at least, they knew the stories. By mid-morning, the Foundation's SUVs were long gone. The neighbors huddled in small knots on their lawns, whispering. Some wouldn't make eye contact with Mark at all. Others stared openly, as if seeing him for the first time. Not the quiet man with the Jeep, but something far more dangerous. And then there was Marjorie Klein. She marched across the street in her heels and pearls, as if nothing had happened, as if last night hadn't turned their neighborhood into a battlefield. Her eyes burned with venom. "You've ruined everything," she spat, standing at the edge of Mark's driveway. This was supposed to be a safe, orderly community. "You brought chaos here." Mark leaned against his porch rail, his shoulder bandaged, his expression unreadable. "I didn't bring them here. You opened the door for them." Marjorie's face twisted. "They offered structure, authority, something this place desperately needed. And you turned it into a circus of violence." Mark's voice dropped, cold and steady. "They weren't offering authority. They were offering control, and you were too eager to hand it over." For a flicker of a moment, doubt crossed her face. But pride won. She lifted her chin, hissed, "You won't last here. People don't want a killer in their neighborhood." Then she stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Mark exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. He just felt the weight of inevitability pressing in. By noon, Director Ellen Graves arrived in an unmarked sedan. She stepped out in her usual sharp suit, her expression taut as she surveyed the wreckage. "You've made quite a mess," she said, though her tone carried more concern than reproach. "They came for me," Mark replied, "and they'll be back. This wasn't random. They're after the drives." Ellen's gaze hardened. "You should have handed those over when you retired." Mark's eyes flashed. "And we both know the Bureau would have buried them. Those drives hold names of men who risked their lives for us. If the Foundation gets them, those men die. That's why I kept them." For the first time, Ellen's shoulders softened. She looked at him not as her agent, but as a man who had carried too much for too long. "So what's your plan?" Mark glanced around the neighborhood, his scarred house, the terrified neighbors, the quiet dog at his feet. "I don't run. Not anymore. If they want to fight, they'll get it here. On my terms." Ellen studied him for a long beat, then gave a small nod. "We'll keep an eye on you. But Donovan." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Don't lose yourself again. You left for a reason." He didn't answer. She already knew the truth. Over the next week, Willow Creek slowly stitched itself back together. Contractors hammered plywood over shattered windows. Families whispered about moving away. The HOA newsletter went silent. The cul-de-sac's perfect veneer had cracked wide open. And yet, a strange shift happened too. Harold, the retired dentist, walked over one morning with a thermos of coffee and sat on Mark's porch without a word. Jenny, the PTA mom, started waving when she passed by, her kids trailing behind her. Even the golden retriever began making daily visits, napping by Mark's chair. They didn't say it outright, but Mark could feel it. The neighbors weren't afraid of him anymore. They were reassured. For the first time, they understood he wasn't a threat. He was their shield. Marjorie, of course, remained silent behind her blinds, the queen without her crown. One night, as autumn deepened, Mark sat by his fire pit in the backyard. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark sky. He sipped a beer, listening to the crackle of the fire. The drives were locked away again, hidden where no one would think to look. He knew the Foundation hadn't forgotten. He knew they would regroup, rebuild, and come again. But when they did, he would be ready. For years, Mark Donovan had tried to escape who he was. A weapon, a protector, a man who had stared into the darkest corners of the world and lived. But here, on this quiet street, he had finally realized something. He didn't need to run from it anymore. Because sometimes the only way to protect peace was to be the storm that guarded it. The fire popped, embers floating into the night sky. Mark leaned back, eyes steady, jaw set. Willow Creek was safe, for now. But anyone who dared to test it again would learn the truth the hard way. Mark Donovan wasn't just the quiet man at the end of the street. He was the most feared FBI agent in the country. And he was home. If you enjoyed this intense story, smash that like button and subscribe for more gripping, cinematic tales. Don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss the next thriller. Your support keeps these stories coming.